Just delighted to see you all here, and thank you so much for taking the trouble to come. Sorry we're a few minutes late. We were held up at the White House where we had a very good discussion with Vice President Vance. My delegation and I are here at the end, or towards the end now, of a 5-country tour. It began on the 24th of May when we landed in New York on our way to Georgetown, Guyana. Before returning to our flight to Guyana, we made it a point to go to the 9/11 Memorial and convey very strongly our solidarity with victims of terror anywhere and everywhere. As you know, many nationalities lost lives during that particular episode. We then went to Guyana, to Panama, to Colombia, to Brazil, and finally ended up in Washington, landing day before yesterday, and yesterday onwards we've been busy. Lots of meetings on the Hill yesterday with the House and Senate representatives, and today we've begun with a session of the Council on Foreign Relations, followed by a meeting with Vice President Vance, and now with all of you. Our delegation consists of 8 people, 7 members of Parliament, and a former ambassador to the US, Ambassador Sandhu. And the 8 of us represent 8 different states in India. We represent 5 different political parties, and we represent 3 different religions. So we really do cover, in many ways, the diversity of India. But we are here with a united message. And that message is, very simply, we seek understanding for what we have been through in recent weeks, the horror of the terrorist attack on Pahalgam that killed 22 holidaymakers, and I beg your pardon, 26 holidaymakers. And then we responded as we felt we had no choice but to do, and we sought understanding and solidarity on that. And I'm very pleased to say that everywhere we went, and I could say this quite confidently without exception, we have received both of what we sought. We have received understanding and we have received solidarity. And these 2 things is really what we came for. And we will continue in the remaining time today and tomorrow to meet others. I want to stress one thing, and then I'll be very happy to open it up for discussions. And that thing is quite simply that this is not something we would really have been wanting to spend our time on. We are a country focused on growth and development. Our focus has entirely been on the economic advances that are so essential to pull the few people who remain below the poverty line in our country out below that, and to take the rest into the developed India of our dreams. But sadly, when this kind of thing is done to us, and for very cynical motives, which I think are pretty apparent, so I won't spell them out, it was necessary for us to show that we will not allow people to cross the border and kill our citizens with impunity. That for terror strikes like this, which show all the hallmarks of meticulous planning and military-style execution, that there will be a price to pay. And that was very strongly the message that we sent. As I say, we're very happy to get back to the business of development. We wish our neighbors would do the same and focus on their own internal issues, rather than inflicting this pain on us. But if they do, we will be there to respond. And that really is very simply the message I wanted to leave you with at the start of this discussion. But we have an hour, and I'm very open to my colleagues and I are very open to any of the questions or issues on which you might want our views. Thank you. Sunanda, do you have a mic for them?
No, sir, I just, Lisa Curtis is here. I would request her to ask her question.
Thank you. Hello.
Hi.
Is it on? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. Great to see you, Dr. Tarur and everybody else. And first, let me express my sincere condolences and outrage about the April 22nd terrorist attack. Somebody like me who's been following U.S.-India relations for 30 years has seen this happen, similar things happen in the past, has seen many India-Pakistan crises. And of course, one feels frustrated that these kinds of things keep happening. So my question is, do you plan, does any government or parliamentarians plan to pursue any steps with the United States or the international community to pressure Pakistan to crack down soil, like Jaish Muhammad, like the Lashkar-e-Taiba? Or do you feel like this has already been tried, and so there's really no purpose in keeping going down that path? You know, what is there any plans to try to get the international community to put more pressure on Pakistan for its support to terrorism, or do you feel like that is there's no purpose in trying to go down that path again?
If I may say, and you know this because you've been following it for so long, we have tried everything for a very long time. And nothing, unfortunately, seems to have changed Pakistan's behavior. I think the most egregious example was 2008 Mumbai, not just because of the 170 victims, including a few American citizens, but also because of the extraordinary amount of detailed evidence that was collated and put together, not just by India, but by the international community. We know Western intelligence agencies had also received that, or had already made the same recording that we did of the chilling voice of the Pakistani handler giving minute-by-minute instructions to the killers while they were doing their dirty deeds. We know, we have the detailed confession of the killer who was caught alive, including his address, where he lived in Pakistan, where he was trained, who trained him, everything. So it's literally, it should have been an open and shut case for a prosecution. To this day, 17 years later, nobody has been prosecuted and nobody has been punished. That is sadly a pretty clear indication of Pakistan's inability or unwillingness to do what the international community has asked of it repeatedly. On top of that, as you rightly point out, there are safe havens for these organizations, which are known, their addresses are known, their training camps are known, their more notorious preachers are known, who go around radicalizing unemployed youth and trying to bring about the kind of horrors that we've seen. Finally, the mic has come on. Were you able to hear me so far? All right. And I just wanted to say that I don't think we'll ever give up in demanding of Pakistan what is obviously the right thing to do. But I think it would be naive of us to expect them to show a greater willingness to act than they have shown in all these years of their use of terrorism. You may remember there was a brief period, ironically, which was interrupted by the Mumbai tragedy, of about 5 years when there weren't terror attacks, where in fact there was dialogue. In that particular instance, when you had a government in power that had been elected on a platform of peace with India, that had made all the appropriate noises, and whose foreign minister was in Delhi that very day to sign an agreement on visa liberalization, that's when the attack happened. So as I say, either unable or unwilling, or both, to deal with this problem in their midst. And so certainly we have assurances from the US that they're talking to Pakistan all the time on these matters. Whether that's led anywhere is for you and me to judge from the results on the ground. Do tell us who you are. I'm not sure that all our colleagues know. We should have asked you to.
Oh, Lisa Curtis. And
You and I know each other,
yes.
but just to tell my colleagues, Lisa used to be a senior official dealing with India in the previous Trump administration.
Yeah, that's right.
Aparna Pandey, Hudson Institute. Good to see you. Good to see others. My question ties into Lisa, but slightly bigger. At the end of the day, India's primary threat and concern is China. And the China factor played into the recent conflict. So I'd like your take on how India sees the China factor in this, and how much attention should India pay on Pakistan versus paying on China? Will it detract from China, from India's bandwidth?
Yeah, I mean, let me say, this is an on-the-record conversation. I'm not going to mince my words, but we are aware that China has immense stakes in Pakistan. The largest single project under the Belt and Road Initiative is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. We also know that 81%, according to published sources, of Pakistani defense equipment, defense may be the wrong word here, offense in many ways, is from China. The weapon systems are from China. And so China is an absolutely impossible factor to ignore in what has been our confrontation with Pakistan. Having said that, you're also aware that despite the tensions between China and India since the Galwan incident of 2020 June, early June, We have actually begun a thaw with China in September of last year, which was seemingly making good progress before this tragedy occurred, and then we saw a very different China in terms of their practical support for Pakistan, even on the Security Council and so on. So I think, let me just say, and I won't go further right now, that we have no illusions about what the challenges are in our neighborhood. But I want to remind you all that India has consistently chosen a path of keeping open channels of communication even with our adversaries. We have tried as much as possible to focus on development, on growth, on trade. Our trade with China is still at record levels. It's not that we are adopting a posture of hostility, but we would be naive not to be aware of these other currents around it.
Shashi, can I just take that?
Yeah, sure.
One of the things we would like to highlight is in each of the countries we went, there was a general eagerness to work with the largest democracy, as opposed to what is seen as a top-down behavior from the Chinese government very often, whether it is in infrastructure or other areas. So this has given us, we were not primarily there for that, this came as a feedback from many governments, individuals, think tanks, and therefore I think we need to build on the fact that, especially with the United States and many other democracies, we have a duty of care to strengthen those democratic ties and make a case across the world for democracy resurgence, as opposed to what is happening elsewhere. And this is also where our point of view on how do we compete with China longer term probably lands.
Thank you. Sunil, are you playing traffic cop? Just...
I think R20 was available. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Vasudeva Kalyankar from the Citizen Center. My question actually ties into Dr. Aparna Pandey's a little bit. So we've seen robust US-India counterterrorism cooperation mechanisms in the past. So I have a two-part question. The first is, what are some new avenues that India is looking to cooperate with the US on with regard to counterterrorism? And the second question is, as India tries to deal with the challenges in its neighborhood and be more focused on the immediate neighborhood for presumably, the next few years, have you heard any concern in your meetings on the Hill or elsewhere on how much strategic bandwidth this is going to take up for India in dealing with its, with Pakistan or other challenges in the region vis-a-vis its Indo-Pacific agenda?
Actually, no concern on the latter. I think there's a tremendous appreciation for what India is all about bilaterally. In fact, it was very striking that we came with the agenda to talk about terrorism, Operation Sindoor, and recent events. And at every meeting, and this is true in the other countries as well, after a short while we were able to broaden out into the broader aspects of our bilateral cooperation with these countries. And in every case, the mood was one of great interest in the Indian adventure and in India's being part of their growth story. So whether it was Guyana, which of course is experiencing world record levels of growth right now at 30%, whether it was Panama and Colombia, which are trying to sort of refocus their own development narrative in a more international perspective, whether it was Brazil, with which we already have pretty good partnership, or now, even on the Hill yesterday, a lot of talk about cooperating with India on things like technology, pharmaceuticals, the AI supply chain, as it were, of expertise. All of these things are being talked about right up to and including the level of the Vice President. So it's very clear that the US values India as a strategic partner. We value the relationship equally, and we'd like to see it grow and develop. There are multiple tracks of contact between India and the US, right at the top and at working levels, and certainly in areas like technology, in addition to the private sector contacts, the business and investment, which is growing. My friend Milindera, who couldn't be here, he's on another assignment at the moment, loves to talk about the astonishing amount of investment that's been coming in into Indian real estate, for example, by companies like BlackRock and Blackstone and Brookfield and so on. And so there is this tremendous sense of interest in India, faith that India is heading in the right direction, and appreciation for the fact that even on this terrorism issue, we behave with restraint and responsibility. So I think you will find that on the whole, we're on the right track here. I'm not at liberty, or indeed I'm not even able to give you much more detail about details of counterterrorism cooperation. All I can assure you is that it's taking place, and it's taking place extensively and in depth.
So may I just...
Sure.
Just on the point of counterterrorism partnerships, we learned that Brazil and India are very close to coming to an agreement on a comprehensive counterterrorism agreement. One of the first bilateral initiatives of such kind. Also, just like Dr. Tarun mentioned, the sentiment that we saw in all of these countries was in fact of India needs to do more. We need to do more with India. That Indian companies need to be even more ambitious. That Indian government needs to build more state capacity. I mean, this was actually the sentiment. You know, we in fact would have a meeting with Dr. Tarun to kind of prepare what should be our line the next day, what questions that we may anticipate, etc. But in not a single meeting in the last couple of weeks have we encountered a single question from any person we encountered asking questions which we felt were troubling or difficult, because everybody, the moment everybody had clarity on the Operation Sindoor agenda, then they wanted to move on to business, they wanted to talk trade, they wanted India to do more, they wanted us to have much deeper relationship with them. This has been the sentiment overall.
Right.
So with Samir Lalwani in the
Well, maybe I'll take that as a, sorry, Samir Lalwani from CSB. I'll take that as a challenge to ask maybe a more challenging question, which is, do you expect Pakistan to do the same thing again? And if so, what did Operation Sindoor achieve?
I think it achieved the signaling of a very firm resolve. And we are saying this to our interlocutors in other countries as well, which is that if Pakistan leaves us alone, we're very happy to leave them alone. But if they allow this to happen again, or they actually instigate it and direct it, as this one seemed to have been, they will be hit back. We will hit back very hard. And the fact is that this nuclear bogey being waved around by the Pakistanis makes absolutely no sense, because even what happened in Operation Sindoor stopped a long way short of anything approaching what would be considered a nuclear threshold. We're not here to blow up the countries or the world or whatever. We're here to just say, do not take our patience for granted. There have been far too many terrorist attacks. We have responded with superhuman restraint, and I'm afraid with Operation Sindoor, we've signaled the gloves are off. Even then, we did so very responsibly. I draw your attention to the fact that our strikes on the 7th of May, the night of the 6th, 7th of May, only targeted known terrorist bases and headquarters of organizations listed on the State Department's terror designate list, as well as on the UN Committee's list of terrorist organizations, proscribed terrorist organizations. We very carefully did this at 1 o'clock at night, 1:05 to 1:30, to ensure that risk of civilians being around in case anything went astray was minimal, so there would be no collateral damage, and we are confident there was none. There was no collateral damage. In one particular case, we were able to see that we were able to strike the very precise building we aimed at inside a larger campus of one of these terror groups. So we believe we did this extremely correctly, and we signaled to the world and to Pakistan that we were deliberately avoiding any Pakistan government installation, any civilian facility, and even any military facility. So the message was very clear. This is not the opening salvo in what's intended to be a protracted war. This is just retribution against terrorism, and it's going to stop right there. If you stop, we stop. If you start, we reply. And that's exactly what transpired over the next 88 hours. Their actions invited retribution again. The moment their Director General of Military Operations called ours on the 10th of May and said, let's call it off, we said fine. We had never intended to prolong it. So that is the short answer. As far as as your concerns about Pakistan are concerned, we recognize that the facilities we've destroyed can be rebuilt in 6 to 9 months. And we recognize that if Pakistan has no will to dismantle the terror infrastructure, then it'll be there and primed and ready to use again. What we're hoping is that Pakistan sees that this didn't do them a whole lot of good, and that it might be, in fact, it did the army the short-term good of being able to tell their people that they're once again the saviors of their nation, which is probably one of the main motives behind this attack in the first place. But the people of Pakistan, with whom we have no quarrel, should understand that India has absolutely no interest in going to war. Our interest is in focusing on our own development and growth. But if you try and come and interrupt that story, we will give you a blow. And that's what Operation Sindoor did. So the signal is just that, resolve, nothing more.
Shashi, I just want to submit you. One of the things I think underlying your question is this belief that if we do strict actions against terrorism, it may conflagrate more. Let me tell you that there is evidence to offer otherwise. Terrorists actually are usually not very brave because they attack the civilians. And when you put some price on the terror, then they usually relent. And it takes some time. So our track record shows, since Pathankot, which is where we stopped negotiating, when we opened our doors to every person to come in and investigate, and nothing happened. And since Uri, since Balakot, and now since Sindoor, we have seen a general trend downwards in our own country. And secondly, if I take another example of terrorism, which is quasi-terrorism, which is Maoism, you see the resolve of our Home Minister Amit Shah, and he has genuinely gone after them, and you see the number of districts which are shrinking, which are Maoist. So I think we should be bold enough to say that when the price is high, terrorism does come down. If we just stay back and say that if we attack and we do retribution, they will be counter and there's a price that they will believe, I believe that's the wrong theory. The right theory is terrorists are really buzzed. They attack civilians, and therefore if we can get them to the place where they know that there's a price to pay, over a period of time it will come down.
So one second. While we entertain no delusion that Operation Sindoor will teach Pakistan a lesson for good, because it's a habitual offender. We have seen Pakistan's Prime Minister declare, not once but multiple times, that they are on a 1,000-year war against India. And it's their stated state policy to bleed India by 1,000 cuts. And no country in modern history has weaponized terrorism as statecraft. We definitely don't have such delusions. But it is also important to note, not just for India but for other countries, especially the United States, that India's fight against terror is not just India's fight alone. It is, we are fighting the battle on behalf of the whole world, and especially the United States in that geography. Till now, in the very recent past, five Pakistani nationals in US have orchestrated attacks in US soil. Every major terrorist attack in the last couple of decades, which involved blasts starting from 1993 WTC here in New York, to Jeddah, to San Francisco, to multiple bomb blasts in US consulates world over, more than 30 such cases have Pakistani imprint. Even now when India took the measures of Operation Sindoor and attacked the terrorist bases, we eliminated the killers of Daniel Pearl. So we are together in this fight against terror because it will impact both our nations. And when India hits, we are doing the job of the United States as well. It's very important for policymakers here to understand this.
Thank you all very much. Jonathan Panikoff from the Atlantic Council. Yesterday, Pakistan was named vice chair of the Counterterrorism Committee from the UN Security Council. I welcome your interest in that specific point, but I actually rather use it to try to ask about a broader question, which is, given that reaction by the international system, what's India's reaction, but more importantly, what faith is India nowadays putting in multilateral institutions if you have that sort of reaction?
No, I wouldn't go that far as to trash the entire institution. There is a kind of bug-in-the-stern system at the UN where countries take turns in presiding over such bodies, and as you know, there's half a dozen counterterrorism committees and different non-permanent members who had their chance. So as long as Pakistan's on the Security Council, this kind of quote-unquote privilege might come their way. But you must understand that these committees all work on consensus. And it's not really possible for a chairman to single-handedly get something through that the others resist, or push a particular line that other countries are not in favor of. And we are not exactly friendless on the Security Council. So we're fairly confident that that is going to be a designation without much practical consequence. But of course, we have our mission at the UN that will monitor this carefully. As you notice, our delegation did not go to the UN, and we don't see this as, for us, it's more a series of bilateral exercises with countries that we believe need to be sensitized to our point of view, and as I said, that mission has been successful. Thanks, Jonathan.
So, Rick Russell from CSIS.
Dr. Thurr, delegation, great to see you all. Rick Ross with CSIS. In this Waters Treaty, we saw the diplomatic steps after the terror attack, and many of which we recognize, but that was obviously a step in a new and different and important direction. I know your government has petitioned a number of times through the treaty to talk about reallocation because of a lot of the changes that happened with population and livelihoods. But what does that look like? Obviously, it's a long-term process to change the water and usage and things like that, even if the treaty's not there. But you know, there has to be some kind of process you hope to see initiated at some point to see that reallocation begin. I know it's so quick after the attacks, it's tough to think about, but what does that look like to begin to repair that damage as well and see what the future looks like for Indus Water?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, there is a bit of a challenge here in the sense that we've been trying for 2 years to get the Pakistanis to talk about the treaty. You're right about the demographic changes, but it's not just that. There's climate change. Glaciers are melting in the Himalayas. And that's going to have a short-term effect of more water coming down and a long-term effect of less water. We need to face up to these realities. There's significant technological change in both dam engineering and dam management, which is simply not foreseen in the treaty. You know, the treaty reflects how much people knew and understood back in 1960, 61. Today, clearly, there's a lot of stuff that needs to be rethought through. And it can be done in a way that serves both countries' interests. And we approach the matter constructively. And for 2 years, Pakistan has obstructed any discussion on the matter. So it was very clear they had no interest in talking about this. And from our point of view, we have no interest in perpetuating an inefficient and unproductive treaty. The preamble of the treaty says it's concluded in the spirit of goodwill and friendship. Where is the goodwill and friendship coming to us from Pakistan? Instead of inflicting terrorism on us, goodwill and friendship is simply absent, right? So I mean, we would like to see, quite frankly, Pakistan start to show some goodwill and friendship before we put the treaty back on the table. Right now, as far as we're concerned, it's an abeyance, which means that we are not going to consider the treaty to be functioning validly today, and let Pakistan understand that they need to show very clear signals to us and to the world that they are serious about dismantling the infrastructure of terrorism before we talk about anything that reflects goodwill and friendship that we're not getting from their side.
Aman Thakkar from Asia Group, and then we'll go to that one.
Thank you very much. Aman Thakkar from the Asia Group and CSIS. I understand, Dr. Tharoor, Mr. Surya, you said that you got understanding and welcome views from all the capitals and countries that you visited.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm still curious, about any misconceptions that you still faced in your interactions, and particularly, Mr. Tripathi, I saw that in your social media post when you were in Colombia, there was a statement that this delegation helped correct and point out that allowed for a better understanding of India's perspectives. I was curious in the US instance whether there was isolationist wing of the Republican Party or President Trump's tweets about the role of trade and his role of bringing trade into the conversation, bringing a ceasefire, how those misconceptions were either addressed or pointed out, and what the reaction and receptivity was to those statements by this delegation to those comments.
Right. Colombia was the only place where there had been a statement that troubled us. It was a statement issued on the 8th of May that expressed heartfelt condolences to the Pakistani victims, which kind of threw us a bit. And so when we arrived in Bogota, it so happened the way the schedule was made that the first thing we did was a press conference. So I took the opportunity to express publicly my disappointment. That night there was a welcome dinner for us, which involved a very senior official dealing with such matters in the ministry, and we conveyed to her privately our real problem with this. And once the context was explained, the next morning at the meeting with the acting foreign minister, the foreign minister was away, immediately they announced the withdrawal of that statement. And they subsequently spoke to the media in Bogota, expressing full support and understanding, both for our problems on the 22nd of April, but also for our response and our right to defend ourselves against terror. One of the points we find ourselves making everywhere, because when sometimes out of a positive mindset for peace, people start talking about can't we promote some dialogue with you guys and so on, and we make it very clear to them. No one does a dialogue with a gun pointed at their heads. And from our point of view, we're always willing to talk. We have multiple languages in common with the Pakistanis. We can talk to them in any language they want. But they prefer, unfortunately, the language of force, and this is why we've had to reply in that language. I can tell you very sincerely that once we explain that there can be no equivalence between terrorists and their victims, there can be no equivalence between a state that provides safe haven to terror and a state that has repeatedly been at the receiving end of terrorist attacks, that there can be no equivalence between a state from which attacks occur and a state which is exercising its right of self-defense. Unanimously, we've had full agreement on these points. Absolutely nobody, and I do not exclude anyone on our list of meetings, has in any way demurred. In fact, they've all said we fully understand what you're saying, and we fully agree with all this. So let me say that there were no real serious misgivings. On your final point about trade, look, as far as India was concerned, we have very good sort of trade negotiations going on a completely separate track. But the officials in India, the foreign minister included, who received calls during the crisis, have all confirmed to me that trade has never been mentioned. So it's all been completely separate tracks, as it were. And on the questions about the concerns expressed about the crisis, the conflict, our responses and clarifications as to what we were doing, and our stress that if they stop, we will stop, that message was consistent throughout, and it was completely unconnected to any other topic.
In Colombia, in fact, we had a very interesting conversation with a sitting parliamentarian who is very well versed with India, is a volunteer of the Art of Living, visited even India to get married according to Hindu traditions. So when we discussed this and broached this subject about Colombia's stand and asked him, is this a result of a certain prejudice? He said, no, it is a result of ignorance. So he said, in many occasions, positions people take to service India may not always be because of prejudice, but it will also be because of ignorance. So it's incumbent on us to actually reach out and have conversations, make these engagements, to actually dispel certain notions and put our story across. Because in today's digital, social media first world, who tells the story owns the story. So I think in that sense, the Prime Minister's idea of sending delegations all across the country, all across the world, to engage with multiple stakeholders is very important to put our story in perspective.
And I think in that story, just one last comment on that, in that story, what surprised me personally, and I think many of us, was the enormous influence of the diaspora. Of course, we tell a story, the embassy tells a story, but I think the story that is lived in that country through the diaspora is an amazing one. And if some of you saw, we talked about it yesterday, the kind of integrity, not just in the United States, but in Ghana, in Colombia, in Panama, in Brazil also. Although Brazil, we did not meet many because we were in Brasilia, but I know that Sao Paulo and Rio have got many Indians. I think that was quite an amazing eye-opener for all of us. The presence, the impact, and the positive inspiration that our diaspora is giving to the India story is quite amazing.
A pleasure to meet you, and thank you so much for doing this session with us.
Who's that? Where is that?
Oh, hi, sorry. Hi, Sadulabay from the East West Side. Thanks again for doing this. Two questions. Question one, what have been, and President Trump is scheduled to go to in November, possibly for Quad, that's up in the discussion. What would you like to see the United States deliver in terms of the issue that you brought forth here, not general U.S. policy or counterterrorism, but on this issue? And what would you like the United States to do vis-a-vis Pakistan in the next 6 months? And I must ask you, what have been, apart from the positive things the United States has done in this context, what have been some of the suboptimal things that the U.S. has done from your perspective, which it could have perhaps done better, please?
You're expecting me to be as irresponsible as India has been responsible on these matters. And look, let me stress first of all, with enormous respect for the United States, for the White House, for the State Department, we would not presume to tell them what they should do. And indeed, I think in all fairness, they don't ask us either what they should do. But we talk, the dialogue is outstanding, and it's at all levels. It's at the highest level, it's at working levels, and it's in between. And I must say that across the board, and the entire range of issues that India and the US have had the occasion to cooperate on, we have found communication channels to be absolutely superb, and the traffic has been two-way. So on the whole, what we'd like to do is see more of the same. We really would like to see this relationship expand to its fullest potential. I must say this is what we hear from others as well. Whether it's the Vice President talking about the extraordinary energy that he sees in India, that he'd like to see development moving forward, whether it's at the sort of diplomatic exchanges level, we are really seeing a tremendous enthusiasm and interest. What goes on between the US and a third country beyond the point is not something that I can speculate on and tell you about. I think as part of these dialogues, all these matters will be touched upon. And surely, if the US wants to tell us what messages they're relaying to a troublesome friend, no doubt they will tell us. But at this point, I really have nothing to add on that. Taranjeet, do you want to say anything about this? You've been privy to a lot of these conversations over the last few years. I think it might be good for you to add something.
Thank you. I think since these are very, very informed friends, so I don't need to go over some of the basics which all of you know very well. But there's 3 points I want to leave. Since you represent a lot of thinking that's done in the United States. Firstly, as our leader mentioned, the action was very clear, focused on terrorists. And these terrorists are no friends of the United States. I don't need to explain more. In the past you have seen. This can also hit in the future. So there needs to be a much deeper understanding of what's going on in that area. Secondly, whenever, and I know there are experts sitting here, whenever the Pakistan army has faced a challenge, many examples are there. It looks to create tension with India. So keep that in mind. Therefore, when the United States is dealing with Pakistan or the real power there, that's the army, this aspect needs to be kept in mind, and then just get excited and taken over by the nuclear aspect as. And the last part, I think all of you know, there is a link up between China and Pakistan. And that has implications for the United States too. Thank you.
Ma'am, I just want to take on from where Ambassador said about the Pakistan and China involvement. Close to 90% of world's shipbuilding today happens between China, Japan, and South Korea. This is a very fundamental depiction, a symbolic depiction of why United States very seriously needs to rehaul, revamp the manufacturing and supply chains routes all over the world. There is no country better suited for this than India today. This is not just trade, but is also of eminent strategic importance for the United States to realize this. 81% of Pakistan's military hardware comes from China. The most important arm of the BRI initiative goes through China, goes through Pakistan. You cannot be having a very unstable nation like Pakistan, which is being armed by somebody who does not have the best interest for the United States. And while the deepening of trade with India, the relocation of manufacturing and supply chains will definitely benefit the United States from an economic perspective, it is also extremely important to look at this from a strategic perspective as well.
Mr. Atman Trivedi.
Hi, Atman Trivedi with the Albright Stonebridge Group and the Atlantic Council. I wanted to pick up where we left off on that last response. You know, India's economy has really become the envy of the world in some respects. The robust growth rates, investment, green shoots as supply chains begin the process of shifting to a more trusted, reliable destination in India. I'm wondering if you can talk to what, if any impact you think the events of you know, the 88 hours earlier this month, what impact, if any, the crisis has had on India's economy, and then how do we return the focus, you know, going forward to this terrific story that's taking place in India? Thank you.
I might say it's already returned. Just look at the stock markets, look at the patterns. There was obviously a little bit of a hiccup during the fighting because investors don't like wars, and that's common sense. But very quickly, once that was over, everything seems to have rebounded. And look, we've been focused on our growth story for some time, and this really is the principal preoccupation of people in India. When you come there and talk to people, you don't really find a lot of people, except during that period of great tension in the aftermath of Pahalgam and the actual fighting, you don't find a lot of people obsessed with either our neighbors or even with what they've been doing to us through terrorism. People are interested in their own future and their better lives and what needs to be done for them to grow. And you know, that's India. I mean, I really think that our message, and this has been consistent to our neighbors, is we really don't want to hassle you guys. You know, you do your own thing, look after your own people. Just leave us in peace to do our thing and grow our country. So when Pakistan unfortunately incubates these terrorists and then sends them across, we have every reason to turn around and say, you've got to stop this. And if you won't stop it by us asking, we will teach you to stop it. And that's really what's been happening. Otherwise, the growth story is in good shape. I'm going to ask Shashank to add to this because he's actually been following the growth story particularly.
No, I think two things. One, without fear, there is no growth. And we need to have a national resolve as the largest country of the world and the largest functioning democracy to send a very strong signal to our citizens that we will protect you if you're harmed, especially by dastardly acts like this. And I think that is something not just we as leaders would like to do, but the citizens expect out of us. And when I went to my constituency shortly after this incident happened, you could see the anxiety in people's mind, and this attack, and therefore our response was to say that no, we will protect our citizens. It's the sovereign right of a republic to protect its citizens. That's a moral principle. But the more practical principle after that is that, as I was expressing to a congresswoman yesterday, that our growth is qualitatively different from that of China. We are people-centric. Arguably, we are slightly slower. But things which are distributed, which are equitable, which are more people-centric, and we can do more. The reason the Honorable Prime Minister has asked for Viksit Bharat is we can do more, and we have to do more for the next 22 years. I'm from the ruling party, I'm saying this openly. But at the same time, the citizen-centric growth of unleashing the private sector, of having less government, more governance, of making sure that the ordinary citizen now believes, after Prime Minister Modi especially, that he can do anything. That Republican energy has been unleashed. And the primary attack of these terrorists was to douse that Republican energy, put fear in the minds of the ordinary citizen. So I believe that once we send a strong message, it does create some hurdles. I think the denominator of that is a much more stronger growth story of period of time. Keep in mind, we are not thinking of the next year, 2 years. Yes, we have to, because we have to get re-elected. But as a nation, all of us are thinking about the next 22 years. We're thinking about Viksit Bharat. We're thinking, where do we get to that 20 trillion economy? And here, I would argue, just one other thing I'd say on the China front, China is the right strategic competitor. We have to say that we will compete and win, not just in GDP terms, culturally, psychologically, giving a new model of governance to the world. Every government we went to were doing business with China, but we could see behind the centers and the Congress people a fair amount of wariness. When you have a BRI project, when hundreds of Chinese are brought in and you start building with external things, which is what is happening in many of these countries, it sends a message that you're not necessarily with that country. So I don't want to expand it too much, but I just want to say that yes, there is a hiccup. Nobody wants war, but it would be wrong of us not to send a very strong signal to the terrorists. Now that's done, let's get back to the job of building.
I just want to add to what Dr. Tharu just mentioned about the neighborhood. Actually, India has been very proactively helping the neighborhood, and also the Indian market is such a huge that many of the neighbors, for example, Sri Lanka, a limited amount of access can also get it through. And the second point I wanted to make here is that you all saw the situation which Sri Lanka went through. And I think people are pretty well aware, at least internationally. It has been written about the bad loans and the debts and the equity game that was played. So there is a larger dimension there too, where India is playing a very stabilizing and a mature role.
Divyansh Kashak with Beacon Global Strategies. This is for everybody, but certainly, Ambassador, would love to hear from you, given your past experience here. And this is on a very different topic. I'll take Dr. Tharu's cue of asking on any topic here. President Trump made a remark about Apple expanding its iPhone assembly in India, and that's not okay. Simultaneously, obviously, US and India are working on a framework on advancing AI infrastructure. India has its own ambitions on digital transformation. Can any of you, and especially want to hear from you, Ambassador Sandhu, what do you think the US gets wrong about India's manufacturing and digital transformation ambitions? And second, what is your message to the US private sector on this trip?
You've been invited to address it, though.
Well, I think I'll pass it on to you, because especially since you had such a good discussion with Vice President, and some of it was touched.
I mean, I'd say that the messages we're getting from the US are by and large very positive about cooperation with India. As you know, on one track there's a bilateral trade discussion going on, though it hasn't concluded yet. The indications are that very good progress is being made. On the other track, there's genuine interest, and in particular, the Vice President raised, for example, the issue of cooperation on AI, because the bits and pieces of AI that require a great deal of collaboration, India can make a contribution with the US that nobody other than China can do. And since China obviously is not going to do it, we can very much emerge as an alternative in a linked cooperation on AI and technology. On the specific issue of Apple, I think this is a different matter between the President and Apple. Apple is continuing with its manufacturing in India, and it's principally for export. There's a good chunk that's also being sold in India. The Apple market in India is expanding. But whether those exports are going to be directed away from the US or not is something Apple will have to decide. I don't know. But I don't think that's related to any fundamental appreciation or lack thereof for India's capabilities in this sector. I think the US understands very much how much India brings to the table in terms of technological capacity, expertise, and even material. So there's tremendous interest, and as I said, it was a VP who raised it, not us. So it's very much on their minds.
I'll just add to that, that the secure supply chains is not a matter that has been forgotten by the United States.
And just your message to the private sector.
A message the private sector's come. I mean, first of all, we have been open for quite some time to the US private sector coming in. And don't just come and put money in the stock market through FDI. Come and actually run businesses in India. And I think that's something that we would truly welcome. Whether you do it in partnership with Indian companies, you just come and work with us. There's some sectors where you can actually run the show yourselves. Come and talk to us. I think there's very much an opening there. If there are things the private sector wants from India in collaboration, we're open to that too. So in other words, if they don't want to come and park themselves in India, but they want to identify Indian partners who can give them things that they can find useful we're quite game on that. It's possible that some of them are waiting for the conclusion of the bilateral trade agreement. It's also possible there are things happening at the moment between private sector companies that we in the sort of public policy space aren't yet privy to, but which may emerge in the near future. But the general sense I'm getting everywhere is very upbeat about India and about Indo-US collaboration across the board. I think really we should see what happened between that terrorist attack and the conclusion of the 88-hour war that followed as really an aberration. That's not the most important thing in the story. We just wanted to come and clarify what that was all about, and now we're very happy to move on to the bigger picture.
I just have one quick thought. First phase of, I would say first phase, but the previous phase of collaboration of private sector in India was very much using Indian manpower and brain power to do what it is required. I think my message or our message to this to the private sector is think of India also as an innovation factory. We don't think of India like that. The 800 million middle class, emerging middle class, the 1.4 billion population is throwing up a number of innovations. So far GCC centers, back offices, software centers, yes. But think of the tremendous problems in health and education and other things which will create this 20 trillion extra GDP that we are talking about. And therefore I think the US industry and the private sector should look at India, no doubt, as a source of great power, not least stealing some of the bright minds from, where stealing is the wrong phrase, but I would say that bringing some of the best bright minds to the USA, you know, Sundar Pichai, Nikesh Arora, Satya Nadella, everyone else. But now thinking about the vast innovation networks that are happening within India, and if that happens, then I think the collaboration is much more joined up because you'll be solving problems of the real India as opposed to just thinking about us as a back office solution. So think about that as well, and that would be the second message I'd like to tell you.
So with your permission.
Of course.
See, when you talk of business cooperation, particularly between the enterprises on both sides, you have to essentially look at a frame of reference in which the four key drivers are defined: trade, technology, capital flows in particular. These three have to be triangulated to see what is the matrix of business opportunities which comes. Add to it another new thing, which is, as you see a kind of new geo-economic template emerging, businesses worldwide, including in particular technology businesses, would look for both opportunities, but at the same time, mitigation of risks. So when Ambassador Sandhu talks of supply chain security, it is essentially a minimization of an enterprise risk that comes from over-concentration of supply chains in particular geography. It particularly applies to the technology domain. Now, when you look at this field, you will find that there is a very strong surge in actual cooperation taking place between the businesses of the two countries, enabled by the policy and regulatory environment of the two countries, in which the US businesses and the Indian businesses converge to both harvest the opportunities but also mitigate the supply chain risk. And it's a very real thing which is actually happening on the ground. So when we talk of supply chain partnership, it is not just a commercial venture, it is also a risk minimization venture for the enterprise, for reducing the enterprise. And when you talk of global value supply chains which get concentrated, I mean, we have a member of our delegation whose city is Bangalore, where most of these GCCs are actually concentrated. That's what it is about. And look, US is the largest trading partner for India. It's the largest technology partner. It's a huge enabler and provider of the capital. Capital flows, of course, are on both sides. Now, add to this dimension, which is the global shifts in the supply chains, which are sectoral, but there are also whole swaths of large domains which are being shifted. Just wanted to add that part. Thank you.
Shashwat from CSI.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Shashwat from CSIS. My question is going back to the Indus Water Treaty and its impact in the neighborhood. Do you anticipate that it will have a broader impact on how water sharing agreements are done in the neighborhood, especially between China and India, because we have two major rivers, Brahmaputra and Satluj, and it was mentioned that China and Pakistan have a very good equation in general geopolitically. So how do you see that impacting India, and the fact that India is downstream to China? So how do you see that impacting the water sharing agreements?
Now, we're very conscious we're downstream from China, and we have been monitoring some of their dam building activity, but as you know, there is no agreement between China and India. So it's been more a question of dialogue. They keep assuring us that what they're doing on the Brahmaputra is a run-of-the-river projects which will not reduce water flows. And as of now, we really have no choice but to take them at their word for it. And we have been trying to do the same thing in the Indus. I mean, we have been trying to have projects that will enable us to use the water to which we are entitled for the benefit of our people, without affecting what happens downstream eventually. But as I say, Pakistan's stubborn refusal to talk to us is the real problem here. I must say, were very generous back in 1960 to come up with an agreement that has been offered to them with such generous terms, and we had not even exercised our complete rights under the treaty. But if they're so unwilling to talk, I don't think that sets a precedent for anyone else, because everybody else is willing to talk. This business of just saying that India is acting without regard to their feelings is wrong, because we have been trying to get them involved in a conversation, and a practical conversation. Even at the technical level, they're not willing to talk. And this is something which we find very challenging. I think at the moment with China, I don't think we've reached a critical stage, and we are talking to them and they're talking to us in terms of the signaling we've got so far. I don't know more about China because that's not my brief in this mission.
Dr. Thru, thank you for those comments. Asfandiyar Mir, Stimson Center. Wondering if I can draw out the IR scholar in you a little bit and get you to, it's not a question, it's, I'm seeking more of a reflection. I feel on counterterrorism, we are in a different era. And some of the talking points and positions I've heard on counterterrorism from the Indian delegation, these appear a bit dated to me, and this is not a criticism. I just think that we're not in this sort of immediate post 9/11 era where there was a very strong global consensus, normative consensus on counterterrorism. And today, I mean, if you take the United States, for example, the US has negotiated with the Taliban, the entity that housed the terrorist group that attacked the United States, and practically the Pakistan equivalent for the United States. The US today is kind of working, it appears, with the Taliban against one set of terrorists, specifically ISIS. We've also seen the United States drop a bounty on a man who has a lot of American blood on his hands, Rajuddin Haqqani. Then you go to the Middle East, the US is giving a second chance to a former Al-Qaeda operative who emerged as the president of the Syrian government. And then you come to Iran, which has also a lot of American blood on its hands. And we see the United States being fairly pragmatic under this administration, and even previously, I think, in the Democratic Party. I'm not saying that you should, I'm not asking you to be pragmatic, but
I guess I'm wondering what is sort of the Indian take, or at least your take, on where the global mood, or at least the Western mood on counterterrorism is at, and how does India seek to navigate that?
Right. So I think that the examples you gave actually buttress the theory that it is when organizations or individuals who were previously associated with terrorism modify their behavior and are in responsible positions to be able to modify not just their own but the behavior of others who work for them and within their systems, then it's worth talking to. That seems to be what the Americans have done. The three examples you gave are all the same. There is no doubt that Syria today wants to be seen as a responsible state, and that the Taliban in Afghanistan are trying to convey similar messages. I'm not saying that everything they do should be things we like, or the things that the US would like. I leave that to you to figure out what it is. But we have also